The clutching weed. There was something about the slimy kelp that was frightening. I was swimming in the ocean in front of my summer bungalow in South Jersey when I first encountered the seaweed and for the first time in years thought of eel Harris. It had been a hot, sticky August day, and the inland breeze brought no coolness, only flies. Wearing only a bathing suit, I had worked as long as I could on the papers I had brought down from the office for the weekend. But at last I yielded to the heat and walked across the beach into the water. It was cool, green, and refreshing, and I started to swim out to the breakers. After a few strokes, my hand pushed through a patch of seaweed. As I shook my hand to get rid of it, the end slapped clammily around my neck. I guess I got excited and started to thrash because I was soon entangled in several strands. A large wave threw me back into shallow water, where I could stand and peel it off. The seaweed was tough and rubbery, in long, wrinkled streamers like the crepe paper we used for party decorations. It had hard brown nodules like staring, malignant eyes, and it seemed to wrap around my hand when I pulled it away from my body. It was completely different from the stringy, Christmas garland-like weed that grew in Bass Lake. Yet as I hurled the distasteful stuff far into the breakers, it made me think of eel Harris in my boyhood summers. It had been so long since I had thought of eel that it took several minutes to remember that his first name was Charles. We called him Eel because he was so good at swimming underwater. His favorite trick was to snake around underwater, fluttering his feet slightly to keep moving, and suddenly pull some unsuspecting person under. As he pushed his victim further toward the bottom of the lake, he'd surface and bellow, "Set him up in the next alley!" Then he'd be off for someone else. We were enemies without actually fighting. I never understood why, but I know he never missed a chance to taunt me or torment me with the most painful roughhousing. When the gang went swimming at Bass Lake, he certainly dunked me more and held me under longer than anyone else. "Well, the twerp," he would say, spitting more water than necessary as he confronted me. "Let's see if you can break this simple little hold." Under I'd go, struggling vainly against his hammerlock until he scornfully shoved me to the surface. I had always been repelled by the waterweed that grew so abundantly in Bass Lake. Once I inadvertently swam through a patch of it, and when it wrapped around my arms, I panicked and started to struggle instead of pulling out slowly. I got thoroughly tangled in the stuff and lost my head. I was underwater, and my lungs were bursting. Still, I thrashed against the weed instead of swimming to the surface. A couple of fellows pulled me up and dragged me to the float. As I sat there panting and persistently removing every trace of the hateful, clinging strands, Eel clambered up with a handful of weed. He draped some around my head like a crown and proclaimed regally, "Guys, meet the new Water King. He can't even fight his way out of a bed of seaweed." The others roared with laughter, and Eel knew he had a wonderful joke. After that, I always went to pieces when I encountered waterweed. Eel took advantage of this, and for the rest of that summer, he always had a bunch of the weed handy so he could throw it over my arms and hold me under while I struggled frantically. One time, I was so frightened I almost didn't make it to the surface when he let go. From then on, I never went in the water if Eel was near. The following year, I beat Eel in the competition for the college scholarship. He hated me for it. "I'd have won if he hadn't cheated," he told anyone who would listen. When they didn't pay attention to him, he muttered menacingly, "I'll get even with him someday." Before that, he had been only playing. But now I knew he was really out to hurt me. I didn't go to Bass Lake at all after that. In the fall, I went to college, and Eel went to sea. After a while, I stopped thinking of him and forgot my fear of waterweed, until that day in the ocean. I knew it was foolish, but after that, I was afraid to swim in front of my bungalow. Even on the hottest days, I trudged a half-mile up the searing sand to the public beach, where there were always several lifeguards. A few weeks later, a storm washed in great quantities of seaweed. I felt a peculiar sense of dread at the thought of swimming in it, even under the eyes of the lifeguards. But the day was hot and glaring, without even a whisper of breeze to disturb the big, buzzing, biting green bottleflies, and my eyes hurt from squinting in the sun. The cool green ocean was so inviting, I went in anyway. Everywhere I went, there seemed to be seaweed. Soon I was entangled in it, and my old fright came back. As I struggled to be rid of it, a wave knocked me off my feet. I struggled to get up and shake off the clinging seaweed. As soon as I shook off one piece, another wrapped around me. One piece wound around my throat like a pair of slimy hands trying to choke me. As I fought against the weed, struggling to come up for air, I realized with a horrible, sickening dread that the weed was actually fighting against me. It was hindering me so much I was being swept out to sea. I struggled harder and more desperately to keep my head above water, but the clutching weed kept my arms bound. I stayed in the grip of the undertow, and I couldn't get to the surface. Somehow I must have yelled for help because the lifeguards came and dragged me out. They pulled the seaweed off my trembling body, and even then, it still seemed to clutch me as though it were waiting for a chance to drag me back to the depths of the sea. "You shouldn't fight the undertow like that, Mac," they said as they pulled me out. "Just relax, let the next wave carry you in, and you can get to the surface." Then they sent me home for a rest. I wish I could be sure it was just the undertow, because when I arrived at the bungalow, the mail included my hometown paper. One story on the front page started, "Charles Harris, a former resident, was reported lost at sea off the New Jersey coast last month." I didn't read any further. I know I'm not going swimming anyplace again.